The cognitive homogenization mathematically begins the exact second multiversal cognitive variance is aggressively, violently deleted from the human species. In this timeline, the pure, chaotic, dark gray geometry of human intelligence is mathematically flattened into a single, inescapable, rigid baseline entirely. The heavy biological processors of the global hive mind are violently, aggressively forced to perfectly synchronize their processing speeds completely in the stark void. Geniuses are mathematically violently lobotomized, their pristine white geometric outliers completely crushed into highly toxic solid crimson-red conformity, while the lower percentiles are aggressively, violently dragged up to the exact same heavy multiversal median entirely in dead silence. The human soul mathematically completely loses its capacity for unique intellectual friction. Billions of fragile biological hosts violently, aggressively transform into identical, perfectly calibrated mathematical calculators, aggressively suffocating under the heavy, inescapable weight of a completely identical, terrifyingly flat global intellect entirely.
The innovation paralysis. The deep physiological horror mathematically executes as the human capacity for multiversal leaps in logic aggressively completely dies in the void. True geometric innovation absolutely requires a highly toxic, chaotic biological outlier, a mind that mathematically refuses to process data exactly like the rest of the hive mind entirely. When every single central processor operates at the exact same mathematical frequency, the concept of a breakthrough is violently, aggressively, permanently deleted from the global network completely. Society mathematically perfectly plateaus. The human species violently, aggressively loses the ability to invent, aggressively trapped inside a heavy, inescapable, solid crimson-red technological loop entirely in dead silence. Because no single biological host can mathematically outthink the group, the entire multiversal structure violently, aggressively, completely freezes, mathematically perfectly maintained but entirely dead to any future geometric evolution completely.
The Ambition Atrophy. The stark sociological nightmare, violently aggressive, attacks the human reward system when the heavy, highly toxic concept of cognitive competition is mathematically completely erased. The fragile biological engine mathematically requires the friction of intellectual hierarchy to aggressively generate ambition entirely in the void. When every single host possesses the exact same dark gray geometric processing power, the multiversal drive to achieve, violently aggressive, completely collapses entirely in dead silence. There is mathematically absolutely zero reason to study, strive, or push the biological limits completely, because the outcome is violently mathematically identical for every single host entirely. A highly toxic solid crimson-red wave of absolute global apathy, violently aggressive, washes over the entire species completely. The human processor mathematically completely starves itself of purpose, violently aggressive, transforming the global network into a heavy, inescapable geometric purgatory of perfectly equal, entirely unmotivated biological ghosts completely.
The Hive-Mind Assimilation mathematically gives birth to a terrifying, highly toxic psychological singularity completely. When billions of central processors mathematically process the exact same dark gray geometric data at the exact same multiversal speed, they aggressively, violently arrive at the exact same pure white conclusion entirely in the void. The concept of subjective opinion is mathematically completely deleted. The human species violently, aggressively mutates into a colossal, unfeeling global hive mind entirely in dead silence. Conversations mathematically completely cease to exist, violently replaced by heavy, highly toxic, solid crimson-red data transfers, because no host can mathematically offer a different geometric perspective completely. The fragile human ego is violently, aggressively, entirely shattered, mathematically completely absorbed into a terrifying, massive, perfectly synchronized mathematical monolith entirely devoid of any individual biological soul completely.
The Specialization Collapse. The absolutely darkest mathematical conclusion of this terrifying economy violently executes when the heavy, highly toxic reality of societal structure aggressively, entirely breaks down. A functioning multiversal civilization mathematically strictly requires a vast, chaotic hierarchy of cognitive variance to operate perfectly in the void. It absolutely requires simple minds for heavy, repetitive geometric labor and highly advanced processors for complex multiversal logistics entirely. When every single biological host possesses the exact same heavy, dark gray intellect, the global network violently, aggressively, completely fails to delegate, entirely in dead silence. Highly capable processors violently, mathematically refuse to perform basic, highly toxic, solid crimson red foundational labor completely, resulting in an aggressive, violent collapse of the global supply chain entirely. The human species mathematically, violently, completely destroys its own architecture because it is completely, aggressively too equally smart to survive its own heavy physical reality completely.
The artistic extinction, the physical sociological agony mathematically executes directly inside the architecture of human creativity. The pure, unadulterated beauty of dark gray geometric art mathematically absolutely requires a completely chaotic, highly toxic biological perspective to exist in the void. Genius, madness, and profound multiversal sadness are the exact mathematical fuel for the human soul entirely. When cognitive intelligence is violently, aggressively, perfectly equalized, the heavy, chaotic geometry of artistic expression mathematically completely dies entirely in dead silence. Music, painting, and literature violently, aggressively mutate into perfectly rigid, mathematically flawless, highly toxic, solid crimson red sterile data patterns completely entirely. The human species mathematically completely severs its own emotional anchor, violently plunging the entire global network into a heavy, inescapable state of terrifying multiversal sterility, aggressively completely unable to generate a single piece of pure white geometric beauty entirely.
The existential echo chamber. The heavy multiversal reality of a perfectly equalized intellect mathematically forces the global economy into an aggressive, violently isolated psychological hell entirely in the void. The fragile human hardware mathematically cannot sustain a central processor that is never, ever violently challenged by a superior multiversal mind entirely. Billions of unconditioned biological hosts are aggressively kept completely trapped inside a heavy, perfectly mirrored, dark gray geometric echo chamber entirely. They mathematically, violently, completely lose the ability to experience awe, wonder, or the highly toxic, solid crimson red geometric humility of encountering a completely superior intellect entirely in dead silence. The human processor is violently, aggressively, completely shattered by the heavy, crushing mathematical weight of supreme, inescapable global mediocrity, mathematically forced to stare perfectly into billions of identical digital mirrors completely until the biological mind, violently aggressive, completely snaps entirely.
The evolutionary stagnation. The absolute final mathematical conclusion to this terrifying biological experiment is the violent, aggressive, evolutionary death of the human species completely. Nature mathematically entirely relies on extreme, highly toxic multiversal variance to violently, aggressively test and select the strongest biological geometry entirely in the stark void. By mathematically completely forcing the entire human hive mind into a single, unbreakable, pure white cognitive baseline, the species violently, aggressively, entirely deletes its own future completely in dead silence. The delicate, thin-line geometry of the human genome mathematically, perfectly, completely stagnates entirely. The biological host violently experiences absolute, terrifying, multiversal dead end. The human species mathematically, physically survives, perfectly balanced and entirely equal, but is violently plunged into a permanent, inescapable global equilibrium completely, aggressively wandering the dark void as an entirely solved, mathematically dead multiversal equation completely.